Let me ask, what about this whole business of Internet of Things, IoT? I would imagine a lot of it has to do involve relational concepts and so on and so forth. For example, if I'm leaving my house, my fans have to go off, but my lights also have to go off. So then it's kind of a relationship that if lights go off, then fans should go off too, or something like. I'm just making something up off the top.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, it's a network, right? When you talk about Internet of Things, we're talking about multiple, small deployed devices that are ultimately connected as a network. Right. Within a house, for example, we'll call it a smart house, right? It has like a smart fridge and smart bulbs and a Wi-Fi router. And there's a local network there in the house of devices that are interconnected. And so again, there comes a graph representation. Notwithstanding the actual graph database itself, if you were to draw a network, on paper, you would draw it as a graph because you'd say, hey, look, this device is connected to this network, which is also then connected to this device. These devices communicate directly. These devices don't, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we're kind of back to that network graph representation, and they're kind of used interchangeably, but they both mean the same thing. And I think this is like the power of graphs. It's such a simple, intuitive representations that you could arguably, describe, from an IT perspective, many things in real life as a graph. Even for instance, biodiversity and an ecosystem, like a natural ecosystem in the wild, like the way a forest, for instance, works. Will have some degree of, it's a network. It's a network of species and plants, and that again works really well. And it allows you to, so the thing is that the representation really allows you to understand how these things work better and what influence, different parts of this graph might have on each other, not necessarily directly. Where things are interesting, not the direct interactions, it's the indirect interactions. What if you were to take something out of that chain? What if I was to take maybe not the trees out of the forest? I think that would not work. But what if I was to take the rabbits out of the forest? What impact would it have on the rest of the ecosystem? And you could quickly determine that based on the relationships from like the rabbits to other points of this ecosystem. And that will have knock-on impacts. It's the same thing as like on the food chain. If you take out the mosquito, a lot of things can go wrong, right? Because this eats that and this eats that. And then suddenly you realize you have cascading problems that are born of the relationships between all these items.
I think the best example of that is bees. I think if bees were to vanish, then
bees is probably the one I should have talked about because that's an actual problem as well. But yeah, that's exactly it.
The whole thing collapses if they are not there, which is pretty fascinating. So I think it's safe to say that I think graph databases are just going to grow in the future. But moving on from graph databases, so once you got started, what did you need to hire people? I'm guessing initially you probably just did all the work, but did you hire people? How did that go if you did end up hiring anyone?
Yeah, so I've worked on Gdotv now for 3.5 years, and I've got my first employee last month, so in June, as we're recording this. So I spent 3.5 years without employees, just me. Without pay as well. I mean, the first time I've paid myself working on Gdotv was last month as well. It's basically just been a part-time bootstrapped effort all along. And there's been some recent changes of circumstances that allowed me, first of all, to hire someone, but also say I'm not bootstrapped anymore, not strictly speaking. It was an interesting kind of situation because the thing to know about me is like I'm a technical guy. I'm not a business person. I'm not a marketing person. I've worked for a startup for 7 years where I've actually done a lot of non-technical activities. I've been to trade shows. I've been to customers, prospects, trying to sell the solution, etc. So I kind of had this understanding of how things could be done. And my thought was, well, look, there's an idea for a product here that's useful, not just to me, but to other people as well. I'm going to focus 95% of my time on just that. Make the product, make something that works, make something that's good, that's useful, and that people want to use. And then I'll worry later about selling it and, making sure that people can find it when they need to find it. So I've been able to do that part-time for a long time. I mean, when you're just a developer working on your solution alone, as long as you know what you want to do and you know how to do it, you can just kind of go ahead and do it. With Gdotv specifically, the timeline was interesting because I started developing it, I think, in November 2020. And at that point, it was just me using it and a couple of my colleagues on and off, just to see like if it was working for them, if they had any feedback. The first time I actually released it officially for other people to use was a whole year later. So I did a whole year of development in my corner before I even had any kind of announcement that I was working on it and that people could use it. And when I first released it, I released it for free. It wasn't open source, but people could use it for free. It was basically an open beta is what I called it. So the idea was, look, I'm making something here, but I can't just, well, I could, but I don't want to immediately assume that it's going to sell. People are going to want to pay for it. There's a bit of an in-between here where I have to validate that what I've made so far is actually going to work, outside of my little bubble. So the open beta was really good for that. There happened to be really good community channels when it comes to the Apache TinkerPop, technology community. They had a Google group with lots of members that was quite active at the time. And around the time I started working on or started releasing it, they were actually creating a Discord server as well with lots of, real heavyweights in the industry, people that have been working on this for years and years in production for different companies. And so when I first announced, that the product was there for people to use for free, I immediately got people trying it. Now I think this is probably the hardest part. And I can't fully relate because I think I've been quite lucky there, but the hardest part of making a product isn't necessarily making it. It has its own challenge, of course, but it's getting people to actually use it, right? How do you go from I've made something to people taking it and doing something with it?
It's that the first days, that's the most difficult and also the most crucial. I have the exact same problem. I have the exact same problem, and I'll be doing exactly the same thing in which, there'll be an initial release and it'll be all free and, just try and get users and get their feedback and so on. So that's great. That's great. So tell, something that I think a lot of people would be interested in hearing is maybe a little more details about your open beta. How many users did you get on the first day or first week?
So this is a crazy thing. I got users on the first day. I got like 15 or 20. So the thing is, I don't really have ways of,
nice.
I didn't at the time have ways of tracking whether I was getting users because people didn't have to sign up for a trial. They didn't have to tell me anything at all about who they were. They could download the software, install it, use it. Right. But because I was doing it, interactively, I was saying, hey, look, this is a solution. Go ahead and try it. People were responding and telling me they've tried it. They would message me. They would usually point out problems as well. Of course, that was the first release. But what I found was that I think probably within the first 6 months of having released an open beta, I probably had about 1,000 people trying it. The first 6 months. So on average, a bit over 150 people a month, which is a huge amount. I mean, for me, it's like, hey, every day someone's trying it. Every day someone will tell me, hey, wouldn't it be nice if it could do this? Because that's a really important thing with the open beta is, I had my sort of view of what I needed to be able to do with a graph database, but I was like a beginner in graph databases, right? But not everyone who works with graph database are beginners. Like some people are experts, and experts have different expectations of what a database client should do than a beginner. A beginner, they're going to want to be able to quickly interact with their database, learn how it works, have access to documentation, for instance, with the database so that they can write their queries for the first time. An expert is going to want to do a whole bunch of different things. They're going to say, well, no, actually, I want to profile my query. I want to be able to debug it. I want to be able to have more complex visual representations of my results so I can present them to other people. So the open beta phase, what it did for me was gather well, Gather obviously is free testing, right? People were testing the solution, finding problems with it, and that gave me stuff to fix. But also they were saying, no, it needs to be able to do this. That will be really useful for me. Or wouldn't it be nice if, you could do this with it as well? It'd be good if it was compatible with this kind of database or that kind. Because at the time I was like, well, I know Janus Graph. That's the one I've been using at a Gremlin server. That's the kind of base one. I didn't realize it was Amazon Neptune, which is probably the one that I should be most interested in, because all the enterprises that use Amazon Neptune, there's Azure Cosmos DB as well, that has its own Gremlin API that don't really push much. You don't really hear much about it, but people do use it. So it allowed me to collect all of that feedback, and then that just gave me a roadmap. Like, I had never had shortage of stuff to work on. In fact, there's always a problem. It's like, wow, there's just too much to do here. So I have to take things one step at a time, prioritize stuff that's important versus stuff that maybe doesn't matter as much. And I was usually based on saying, hey, 15 people are saying you really need to support this database. I want to be able to use it with that database. Cool. Let's just go ahead and do that.
So I would imagine you have to keep updating it because the databases themselves are changing all the time, right? I mean, they're going from version 4 to version 5 or whatever. So you've got to update your tool as well, I would imagine. I mean, obviously, updates are probably not very large, but you still have to do the minor upgrades.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I've kind of always tried to commit to a monthly release cycle. I think pretty much since I've officially released it, there's been consistently a new release every month. And generally the goal with releases are two things. One is just improve the overall look and feel and performance of the application, make sure any bug is fixed, but also try and introduce new features as well. So to say, hey, look, if you keep updating Gdotv, you're not just getting a maintenance release, you're getting new feature. You're going to be able to do more and more and more and more with it. That comes in a few forms as well. Actually, in the time, from when I started working on Gdotv to now, there's been new graph databases that have come out, at least 2 of them. And so I had to go and support them. One thing that I've been really kind of fortunate with, I think, in the development cycle of Gdotv is that even though, those databases have evolved significantly, there's been new versions of the Apache TinkerPop framework, for instance. That's the best example. If the Apache TinkerPop framework changes, every database vendor is going to eventually adopt it. So it's always like, hey, whenever they're doing something, I'm going to need to get on top of that and support it. But they've not really ever, there's been significant changes, but there hasn't been breaking changes, which is great. The way that the framework and the database providers have evolved is in such a way that everything still works very much the same, just better with new features. I didn't really get in a situation where someone's saying, no, you can't do this anymore. So you can do it on this version, but you can't do it on this version anymore, which obviously is problematic. It's very difficult. Then you get into situations where you're like, well, I can only offer this feature if you're on this version of the database, but not that one. And that's not happened much. There's been a couple minor examples, like for instance, Janus Graph had its 1.0 release a few months ago, and there was some significant changes here. That was their first major version number changes. But I mean, when you think about major version changes on an API, for instance, when an API changes major version, man, it's a lot of work to move. There's just tons and tons and tons of migration to do. Whereas with those databases, they just evolve in such a stable way, which is normal. Databases should evolve in a stable way. Major changes to the database mean just major changes to applications that use them, and people don't usually have much of an appetite for that. It can be deterring to say, oh man, if I want to support the latest version of the database, suddenly I have to rewrite half of all my queries. So that's worked really well for me.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting, very useful information. So let's now move to money. You already said you bootstrapped it. And no, well, that's always a big challenge for all startups, all entrepreneurs, right? Because that's always in short supply. But I think in your case, again, is worked out quite well, because I think probably your costs aren't that significant, right? Probably in the beginning, I'm guessing at this point, you probably have some decent amount of costs and operating expenses.
Yeah, well, so this is the thing, and this is probably the most important decision I've made early on with Gdotv. When I've decided to make it a software executable rather than a website, something that needs to be deployed. What I've essentially done is solved a whole bunch of problems right from the start. So I've kind of briefly mentioned earlier the data privacy aspect. People are going to be naturally reluctant to use a platform that interacts with their data if they're not hosting it or if they don't own it fully, simply because it's like, well, look, what are you doing with my data? I don't know. As a software executable, like I mentioned, it's on their network. I've got no infrastructure. They can constantly run the software and know that everything stays in their network. But actually, it does a whole lot of other things for me, right? Because if I've got no infrastructure, I've got no infrastructure costs. I've got no operational costs, right? If I've got no infrastructure to maintain, I don't have a bill to pay to AWS or Azure or Google Cloud Platform. I don't have to be spending some of my time maintaining the infrastructure as well. If the infrastructure evolves, it needs to be kept up to date. You have to make sure it's secure, etc., etc. So my costs are, just simply speaking, were like incredibly low. I mean, I think the first 2 years I was probably spending on average less than, I'll say in dollars, just so it's a bit more, people can picture that a bit better, probably less than $100 a month. I mean, I think for the first 6 months, at least, all I was paying for really was hosting the website on AWS, which is like, I don't know, $5 a month, right. And the other thing is, because I've been relying a lot on community, the technology community that will use the software and like direct interaction with them, that means I've had it for a real long time. Again, just no marketing costs, right? To this day, still have very little marketing costs. I've had to, I've had to improve things a little bit here. For a long time, I was very like, hey, just download and use it. I don't care who you are. I don't want to hear about you. You can just use it for free for as long as you want. When I started moving into a, paid product, I had to consider a few things like licensing, marketing, people being able to sign up for a trial and me being able to communicate back to them more centrally, right? So like, for instance, if someone signs up for a trial, they can decide, hey, well, just sign me up for the newsletter so that whenever there's an update, I'll receive an email telling me about it. So these are kind of brought, some costs, but I mean, they're really small. I mean, if you pay for something like HubSpot as a small company, you have access to a lot of discounts, and it's not, you don't need to be on the mega tier to be able to do cool things with it. So, I mean, realistically, my only cost was labor. If I'm the one working on it and I don't pay myself, then that just costs me nothing, which is good. Obviously, it cost me time. This is the main thing that it cost me. It cost me a lot of time. I've been working on it for years, part-time, without pay. So that costs me in that sense. But, it's not something that I have to pay up front. And that's I think, generally what people expect with the bootstrap model. I guess when you're bootstrapping a company, you either happen to have a lot of money to begin with that you can invest in your company and perhaps in hiring people as such, or you're like me, you don't have a lot of money, in fact, none to invest, so you just invest your time instead.
No, I think your startup story is exactly textbook on how it should be done, in the sense that you get an idea that's fills a missing need, and then you do it. It's totally cheap bootstrap way, and then you get it to market, and marketing also happens by itself, just because I think mainly it was because it was fulfilling a need that wasn't being met, I would imagine. And I mean, it's just totally textbook. It's just textbook. how
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad they went that way, because I mean, when I started doing this, I had no priors and making something by myself or making a company and such, and I didn't really even consider, I guess, literature or research into, hey, how do you do it? I mean, apart from the legal stuff, you're making software, you're selling, you need an official business, you need to make sure you've got like your code signing, etc., stuff like that. Obviously, and I kind of knew from my job anyway, just being in cybersecurity. But besides that, I didn't really spend much time looking into it. That just allowed me to focus mostly on the product stuff. Even funding, which I did look into funding. To be fair, I did try to get funding, but I realized quite early on that acquiring private funding is very time consuming, and it's very difficult. And on top of that, when I was at a stage where I was potentially going to benefit from funding, it was just right around the sort of Silicon Valley Bank crash, which created us. And COVID, I mean, I've been working on this through the COVID years, and then that happened. So like the funding sort of landscape was just not good in general. Not to mention also I've got like, I just have zero network when it comes to, I don't like know some investors, I don't know like, angel investors or whatever. And I live in Scotland, which I'm not saying Scotland is a bad place to live for investment. That's not what I'm saying at all. But, I think if you compare it, for instance, to the United States, or I think even India for that matter, it's a very different landscape. And therefore, my options were limited. It was very time consuming. I tried it. I didn't succeed. And I thought, that's fine. I'm making the thing. People are using it. That's all I need.
But you aren't too far from London. And I would imagine that's,
Technically, yeah. I'm not far from London. That's true. And I think I was kind of prioritizing for some reason funding locally. I think for me, it's always just like I've always preferred, a local environment in general with work and with, everything else. For instance, when I'm working with, my accountant is in Glasgow. I live in Glasgow. They're like 20 minutes away. My SEO, like the SEO company that helps me, with marketing also is 20 minutes. So I've just always had this like weird preference for places that are close by because those are people that I can meet. And I'd never really, I did try with London companies to be fair, but I was also prioritizing Scottish investment ecosystems just purely on the basis that these are people that are fairly aware of the intricacies of, growing a company in Scotland specifically, because access to, network, it's probably different in Scotland than it is in London. London is bigger than all of Scotland, like population-wise. So you can quickly see how there's like unique challenges.
I only mentioned London because there's a lot of money there, and then
absolutely. And the thing is, like, if I have to travel to London, I'm working part-time on this. I have a full-time job that I'm still working on here. I can't just hop on the train on any day and be like, let's go to London. But yeah.
You mentioned you're originally from France. So how about France? I mean, I know France is very technologically oriented. They have a very good space program. So
yeah, absolutely. I think with France specifically, and the thing is, I haven't even looked into it, but I very much expect that if I were to seek investment, from France, it would be on the basis that I work in France as well, which for me just wasn't possible. I have a family here. I've pretty much made my life in Scotland, and so that wasn't going to be an option. Even though technically I would have like everything I need, like I would be able to talk French to investors, etc. So, but then, there are even simple barriers, like legal barriers, right? With Brexit, especially. Brexit, I think, possibly muddied the water a lot there. But, hey, we're a UK company dealing, in pounds. This is Europe dealing in euros. And they're not even like, I think there probably are a lot of European ecosystems for
not
funding startups.
There's also the entire GDPR laws, which I think may not apply to you.
So I think the UK still works on a GDPR basis, and I know it's kind of a boring random topic. For instance, I've adopted GDPR practices right from the start. For a really simple reason, it's the most stringent ones, and therefore, if I'm looking at this on a long-term basis, if I'm on GDPR from the beginning, then I'm going to be safe, right? I'm not going to have to then make major changes to the way I handle data and the way I handle contacts, etc. 3 years down the line, where I've got lots more contacts that will be costly and just really headache-inducing. So we'll just go straight with the worst, the hardest one, and I know at least it's not going to get harder than that, and that's fine. Solutions like HubSpot that I use, are good at helping implement mechanisms to ensure we're GDPR compliant. I use Stripe, for instance, as a payment system, and Stripe, for all its griefs, like the cost model and such, is really good at just taking all of the headaches of the non-technical stuff out of the equation. So I've always prioritized using solutions, for the business that reduce my potential headaches when it comes to non-technical problems. And that comes at a cost, but it doesn't come at an upfront cost quite often. Like Stripe, for instance, says, well, hey, we're going to take care of all this for you. We're just going to take a cut of what people pay. And that's okay. That's okay, because I'm bootstrapped. I'm not going to come up front with that money. Might as well just have it taken at the source when the money comes in.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's totally true. So you mentioned also, I wasn't planning to speak to you about this because I was that aware about your knowledge in this, but you mentioned about identity access and that kind of cybersecurity. Now, I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs and people who view this would be interested in learning a little more about that. Now, typically, people will have either an app or a website or both. So, what kind of identity access mechanism should they adopt? I mean, obviously, there's a whole login password business, but over and above that, what is there something you can speak to us about that?
Yeah, of course. Identity and access management is a really broad space. But I think if we focus on the practical bits of identity and access management, the first thing is, if you're going to have a website in which your users are going to authenticate, it is going to be extremely important to adopt best practices in identity and access management from a security perspective and from a practical perspective. And that kind of depends on what you're doing and what your customers are like. Typically, you're going to have B2C, business to consumer, or B2B, business to business. And things can change quite drastically between these two. For instance, if you're going to be providing a platform, a website, we'll say, that your users are going to authenticate to, that are in the business, that are working as part of their job, you're going to want, well, first of all, regardless of all this, you want good security. You don't want situations where, for instance, you're storing your passwords plain text, and this is where identity and access management solutions can help with that. I'm thinking particularly about Auth0 with that. But you're going to want to offer enterprise provisions like single sign-on and user lifecycle management. So if you're providing an enterprise platform on the website, either deployed locally or deployed on your own, for enterprises to adopt your solution, they need to be able to reduce friction with users. And a typical friction with users is logging into the system, right? If they have to remember passwords, that's going to be a problem. If they can't use second factor authentication, that's also going to be a problem, because if not only they have a password, but there's no extra, mechanism to secure a website, even if you're doing everything right, where your customer credentials, you're hashing them super securely, you're storing them securely, etc. That is a very, very real possibility that your user is just going to have a really bad password. That happens all the time. We've all seen it. And so even if you're doing everything right, your customers can still get breached. And you might argue, well, it's not my fault if the customer is using a stupid password. It's true, but it still is happening on your product. So
right,
you're going to want single sign-on. It's a bad image, exactly. So you want single sign-on. You want to be able to support either SAML, secure social markup language, which is a fairly established single sign-on standard, or OpenID Connect, or IDC, which is a more recent iteration on the concept that's widely adopted. For instance, if you're navigating between Microsoft-owned platforms, the glue that's going to keep all these services together is going to be OpenID Connect. These are super important from a security and user experience perspective. The other thing is, imagine going to your customer with your platform that's going to be used by 2,000 users in the company, and they don't even have a mechanism to add those 2,000 users and to manage them automatically. That's kind of where we go into IGA, identity governance and access, where you don't just want people to be able to log into your website. You want companies to be able to manage access to your product easily. And the easiest way to do it is to support these various standards in the identity and access management space that automate all these processes. One really important concept that most companies, will have a form of user directory, which is basically where they're going to have their employees listed out, maybe group memberships, groups that they belong to, and all that information, businesses expect. So larger businesses, of course, right? If you're a company with 5 employees, you're not going to have the same needs as a company with 2,000 or 10,000 employees. But, those big companies want to be able to leverage their infrastructure to automate as much as possible. They want to be able to say, look, if I'm firing this guy, I don't want to have to then go and remove him from all these systems. That should happen automatically. If I'm hiring this person, then I want to have this person get access to the right platforms based on their job title, for instance, their entitlements, what they do in the company. If I'm a marketing person, maybe I'll need access to Salesforce or HubSpot or some other marketing solution provisioned to me automatically when I join the company. And when I leave, it should be removed, because that also plays into, I mean, for companies, it plays into a whole bunch of other things like licensing, right? If you're paying per seat, you want to be sure that you're, using the seats that you're paying for. That's very important.
Right.
And if you're offering a solution that doesn't give an easy way for companies to do that, to onboard and offboard people, then you're creating a lot of administrative friction and work. It's work to have to go and manage a website and remove and add users. You're creating, potential like lost costs on licenses that are attributed to people that aren't there anymore. That happens quite often. And a company might look at the costs. It depends how you cost your platform, of course. If you're not costing your platform per user, that's less of an issue. And then it becomes maybe more of a hygiene issue on the platform itself. But if you're costing your platform per user, these are very important problems that companies are going to want clear answers on. So you're going to want to adopt best practices. And then there are products out there that exist to simplify that. Auth0 is, which has been acquired by Okta a few years ago now. Okta being an identity and access management solution itself has, for instance, out-of-the-box ready user management APIs that allow you to deploy a user store for your website with authentication, secure storage of credentials, second factor, etc., just all handled by them. It's the CIAM space, the customer identity and access management space, which provides just a ton of features. Even like for B2C, for instance, being able to say sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, sign in with this and that, that can be complicated to manage. And solutions like Auth0 exist to ease that pain at a small fee. You're paying, right? You're paying for Auth0, but you're paying a lot less for a solution like that than you would be to develop everything on your own. You take a lot of time and it would cost a fortune as well. So these are really convenient services.
Okay. That's good to know. I'm sure a lot of users would benefit from that and probably use Auth0. So tell me, Arthur, any interesting stories, anything, stuff that happened in your journey that stands out, stories for the grandkids, that sort of thing?
There's been lots of stuff that I've been really happy about. First of all, I think that's probably the main thing. One thing that really kind of positively shocked me, right? But shocked me nonetheless, was that when I started releasing Gdotv, I kind of had this expectation, being a small company person, having my small, I've always worked for small companies. I started needing this work for my small company. I just stupidly expected people to be like me. They work in small companies, they work with crap spaces, and they're going to need it, which is not true. I mean, it is true, but what I found is that it's a lot of much bigger companies that are using the software. And that really surprised me at first, because I thought, wow, I'm already in a stage where people from generally publicly trading, Fortune 500s, whatever you want to call them, organizations, download my software, install it, and use it in their company, and they find it useful. And then eventually, when I got to the stage where I was able to charge them, they pay for it as well. And that, I know shouldn't be an interesting story in and of itself, but yeah, of course, I'm making a product that kind of want potentially big companies to be using it. That's ultimately my target audience, enterprise. But I didn't realize at the time that my target audience, or my reachable audience, was enterprise. So for me, that was just really nice to see. The other thing I thought was really cool is that while I've been working on Gdotv, I just quickly got to be in touch with industry professionals that work on the databases themselves. So, for instance, very early on, I think probably within 4 weeks of releasing Gdotv, I got to talk with many people at the Amazon Neptune team, which was basically the biggest Apache TinkerPop database available out there. And it's really comforting, first of all, for me. It's like, wow, if I'm making something and they're interested in it and they want to support me in some ways in working with it, well, that's just amazing. And they've been really helpful as well. I mean, providing feedback, for instance, saying, hey, well, actually, we know that our users would like to be able to do this. You should probably look into it. But also just generally providing validation. I think it's just quite important when you're working on something, especially I've been working, like I said, on it for a year, just completely in its completely isolated world where I was the only one really seeing it. And suddenly I got to, receive this it felt like external validation. And it's really important, I think, when you're making something to have something or someone or something that says, hey, you're going in the right direction. If you don't have access to this, you might be ultra motivated. You'll just keep doing it.
So for the year,
but it helps a lot.
So for the year that you were developing it, you didn't actually show like a prototype to people and kind of get their feedback on it and stuff like that.
No, well, so apart from my colleagues in the company I was working for, which were 2 junior developers, and that was very occasional because at the time it was a bit rough around the edges when I was making it, of course. Practically no one had seen it. I think probably before I released it, a maximum of maybe 5 people had seen it or knew about it.
Oh, wow.
And that was it. And they were all people that were in a similar situation as me where they were not they were not experts in the graph space, they were beginners just like me. So it was definitely quite a big shock, but a really good one, positive, like, wow. Now I've got all these people that are providing me feedback and, positive feedback as well, right? I mean, I've kind of just said, like, yeah, I've been told, like, you should do this and you should fix this and that, but a lot of what I've been told as well is like, oh, wow, yeah, this is great. Like, this is really useful. I really like it. I've been able to do this and that. It's a lot easier to write my grammar queries, blah, blah, blah. Like, I've not really talked about the positive feedback, but it's something I still receive, like, regularly to this day. There's a lot of, I've got users that have been using it practically since day one of the open beta that are still using it now and that will, take the time of their day to tell me, when something is good or when something is bad. And that's just amazing. I really love to have that access. It's so like essential to making the product. Like I said, it's just driven the entire roadmap for the product. this entire time is very, very user feedback driven. Of course, I've got my aspirations of things I should do as well that I will put in there, but it's at least 50-50.
I usually talk with people about marketing. I think though, on your case, you don't have a very intensive marketing campaign going on. Or am I wrong in saying that? I think you just...
No, you're correct. So I've not really ever done something that you could call a marketing campaign. Every single lead that I've had, a lead being someone that installs the software and tries it, has been acquired just organically. So I've never had to pay for a lead. Everything's pretty much been SEO based, and it was the right approach. It still is, for a few reasons. First of all, if every lead is organic, that also means it doesn't cost you anything, which is always great. If people are just finding your website and downloading your software, you don't have to pay for that to happen. They just find it. Right. And that's achieved, by the way, in a really simple way in my case. And I think it's kind of unique to the space I'm working in. I'm doing a graph database client. The main place that I'm going to get people, finding out about the solution is from the databases themselves, right? If the documentation for the graph database that those people are using says, those are solutions that you can use with your database. We don't own them. We don't endorse them. We say they exist. They solve certain problems. Here's the links. Go check them out and try them out. And that provides me the traffic. So for instance, I did eventually inquire early on to realize that it's important for me to talk to the maintainers of these solutions to say, hey, can I get Gdotv listed in there? And the good news is they were already doing that for other open source solutions. Some open source solutions, for instance, are listed on the JavaScript website. So it was very simple. It was like asking, and because I was talking to these people sometimes just about technical matters, because we're kind of working together on a few things. I needed their assistance. They were finding some feedback that was proven useful. Then they were like, yeah, let's add the link. And some of course are open source providers. For instance, JavaScript, Apache TinkerPop themselves, RKDB. Some are commercial ones. Commercial ones, obviously, it's a bit trickier. But like I said, because the Amazon Neptune team has been really helpful right from the start, I got the opportunity to add Gdotv on their documentation as well. So they have a section for third-party visualization tools, and there's a page for Gdotv. There's other vendors. So there's one vendor in particular, Aerospike, who launched their graph database last year. I think it's been just a bit over a year now, called Aerospike Graph. And we got in touch, we got talking very early on when they were in a sort of beta phase. And we eventually come to agree that, hey, let's just make Gdotv the database client at launch. Very, featured very prominently say, you want to use Aerospike Graph? We recommend using Gdotv, and we've come to some agreements as well, really simple ones. Like normally I offer a 2 weeks trial. It's actually now a month. But if you're an Aerospike Graph user, I'm actually matching the length of trial that Aerospike Graph offers to its users. So Aerospike Graph, if you want to try it for free, which you should, it's a great graph database, they offer 60 days. And it was like, well, what's the point of offering only 14 days to trial Gdotv with a database that you get to trial for 60 days, right? So we thought, let's just offer a 60-day trial. And that does two things for me. First of all, it helps validate, Gdotv is a very legitimate, which is, of course, but, when you're a small company, there's always challenge that it validates that, hey, Gdotv is an organization that can partner with database vendors to a very, very, advanced extent. So much so that they're launching their product with heavy mentions of ours as well. It, of course, helps with SEO as well. And, when someone signs up for an Aerospike Graph trial, chances are they're going to be heavily suggested to sign up for a Gdotv one. And it's a win-win situation for everyone, right? For Gdotv, of course, that provides me with traffic, that provides me with reputation, that provides me with trialists that can become customers. For Aerospike Graph, it provides their users with the right tools to adopt the database, to work with it, to start developing their prototypes. When you're trialing a new database, you're going to be working on a prototype. Having a solution like Gdotv to prototype your solution is great. It helps people learn about the graph database. It helps them, crucially, it helps them demonstrate what their database looks like to their stakeholders. A technical person, ultimately, when they're building something new, when they're building a proof of concept, they're going to have to show someone, hey, it works, it does stuff, it's good. And Gdotv is a solution that's very often used to demonstrate like proof of concept graph database products internally, because it's like, for a non-technical person, the graph representation is very easy to understand. They see the network and they understand, oh, cool, got a person that's connected to this, or et cetera, et cetera. And the customer wins as well, simply because, well, first of all, they don't have to pay for anything for the first 60 days, which is good. But also, they increase their odds of succeeding in their POC by a lot. If you don't equip yourself with the right tools, when you're trialing something, you're more likely to fail. It's just natural. So when you've got the right tools to help support your proof of concept, then you're naturally just more likely to do better with it, just have a better outcome. You might find that it's going to help drive adoption internally, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very good decision. I'm super happy, and I still work a lot with Aerospike as well. Very much planning to continue doing so. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're starting to run out of time here. So let me just try winding down with asking you, do you have any advice for any budding entrepreneurs or people who are thinking of starting their own startup? Any words of advice, words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, so I can only draw from my personal experience, which is good, but still limited. I think when you're making a new company, when you're making your product, there's just so many different ways to come into it. Mine, of course, was like the kind of bootstrap way. I happen to be the person that not only wants to make something, but is also able to make it, which is always good, right? If you want to make something and, if you can do it yourself, then that means you can just get started right away. Like, you just need to have whatever tools you're in IT especially. I know it's not really the same when you're working in manufacturing, for instance. You can't just have a factory like this, but when you're working in IT, for instance, you're building out your solution, making your demonstrator yourself, like being able to do it yourself without the upfront cost is really useful. Probably getting early feedback is a good idea as well. I probably should have got earlier feedback when I was making Gdotv, because I would have then, come to realize a lot sooner certain decisions weren't the right ones. Of course, I didn't come out and make all the right decisions about the product right away. I came to find out about some of them a year later after I'd made my open beta version. So trying to get that early feedback is not just useful for the way you're going to make your product, but it's actually just reassuring as well.
Right.
It's not a good idea probably to just work on something in complete isolation without the,
Right.
reassurance.
That was something that struck me about your story. It was totally textbook, except for that part.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, it was different circumstances because that all happened during COVID.
Right, yeah.
Couldn't go out, and see. So I think the circumstances maybe just like
that and then
impacted how I did it.
Only highly technical people would understand it, though. So you're
There was that, and that's always been a problem. Yes, of course. For instance, when you talk about funding, my solution is like it's niche, strictly speaking. It's not. We're not talking about millions of users. We're talking about probably tens of thousands of potential users. Right. So when you go out to get funding, first of all, the people you're going to talk to are going to have no idea what you're talking about. Right. So you have the extra legwork when pitching of also demonstrating that what you're working on in the first place has a market. There's no market analysis for graph database clients. That doesn't exist. There's market analysis for graph databases that exist and you can get search, but not for clients. So if you're working on funding, it's always useful. I'm sure I'm not teaching anything to anyone here to have information at hand that validates the market size, the market capabilities, the other market players that might be available to say, hey, actually, we've got a shot here. We can actually come in and do something that others aren't doing yet, or that they're doing, but we can do better and cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there. Funding is definitely not my strong card. I've not got any.
Hey, funding stuff for everyone. The challenge I'm facing with funding is more a catch-22 situation kind of thing, where what I'm finding is funders want to come in once you're everything's going great, you're earning money, you're positive EBITDA. And it's like, well, if I'm in that point, I don't need you. I need you now. I don't need you then.
So that's exactly what happened to me as well. I mean, most private funding groups and people that I've talked to were basically putting as a sort of condition that before we can even talk about investing, you need to be making, say, £250,000 a year. And then it's like, well, if I'm making £250,000 a year by myself on my company, I'm okay. I'm doing really good, actually. And it's like, is it worth scaling at a point where someone's coming in to help with the scaling is just going to reap all the rewards of the work that you've done up till now? That's a tricky question. I'm not particularly... I'm not looking for, scale funding personally. Like I don't really, at this point in time, I can pay myself. I can pay another employee. I will likely be able to pay another employee soon,
Nice.
that I can hire, and it runs operations. And, we're starting to have a separation of concerns. I'm not just the person that does everything. Now there's another person to do this and another person to take care of that. That's a good position to be in if everyone gets paid and everyone, and then there's a foreseeable, period of time where you're not going to run into trouble. So there's this definitely, and there's challenges with scaling as well. If tomorrow I had 10 employees, I would have 10 people that I need to then potentially manage and monitor outputs from, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in my very small team right now, I know everything that's going on. I have a direct influence on everything that's happening. Yes, it's a lot of work and there's a lot of context switching, but you can organize around that. And I don't have external influence that is going to potentially steer the product in a direction that I don't personally agree with. Being the one that makes it, obviously I have my views. An investor might have different views that say, hey, actually, you should do this because this is where all the money is. But do something with AI. Cool. What? Something. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important. I personally really enjoy the independence, and obviously it comes with a whole bunch of struggles, right? Like for instance, having had to work on it for free for myself, free for over 3 years. That's a challenge, but the reward of that, I think, can potentially outweigh the stress of dealing with investments. Doesn't work for everything. Not every business can sustain without investment. Additionally, you can't always build a product without investments. I always find that in IT, it's always a lot easier because we're dealing with a lot of immaterial things, having a computer, some Azure credits, some AWS credits, which you can very easily get. They have very good startup programs that allow you to get those credits. That can allow you to go very far on very little other than your time.
Nice. Well, that was wonderful. There was a lot of very useful, valuable information. Thank you so much, Arthur, for joining us in this video. Arthur's information is going to be below in the description of this video. So please have a look at that. And there'll be a link to his company, Gdotv, as well. And also don't forget to put in your comments and discuss about all of that was discussed here today. Other than that, thank you, Arthur, and thank you for joining us. That hopefully maybe we'll see you again in a part 2.
Thanks, Vivek. That was a lot of fun. Really appreciate you having me here today.
Bye, everyone.